A Newbery Award winner. Johnny Tremain. The year is 1773 and the scene is Boston, Massachusetts. Written by Esther Forbes. This book won the Newbery in 1944. This was during World War II. Esther Forbes was an historian and not a fiction writer. She also had dyslexia, which means you see letters backwards. She wrote a book called Paul Revere and the World He Lived in 1942. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her nonfiction historical book for adults. That's the highest award a book can win in the adult world. This is not a children's author, but decided to try her hand at fiction writing. In the 1700s, guild members would hang a sign outside their shop telling what services they provided. Johnny Tremain is apprenticed to a silversmith. An apprentice works for a silversmith until he learns the trade and can set up his own shop. Mr. Lapham has an important order to fill and is not quite up to the task, so Johnny decides to finish the work himself. On Sunday, the law is that everyone must go to church. But this is Sunday, and Johnny decides to break the Sabbath and work in the shop. The order is just what they need to stay in business. They need this work to bring in other work. So Johnny sets to work. He melts the silver and makes the mold. As he begins to pour in the silver to cast a new handle, something goes terribly wrong. The crucible breaks and molten silver spills on Johnny's hand. Now his life as an apprentice is over. He has no skill and no home and no future. He finds work delivering newspapers for a man named Paul Revere. There was trouble brewing in Boston. The king was charging a tax on everyone's tea, so several men dressed as Indians went down to Boston Harbor and dumped all the tea into the ocean. We call this the Boston Tea Party. With new friends like Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock, his life is about to get very exciting. And now I'll read an excerpt from Johnny Tremain by Esther Forbes. Sunday afternoon, and the work went forward with never a hitch. Even Dove and Dusty were good and obedient, although Dove was half threatening to tell old Grandpa when he got home. Johnny did not care what his master might say, only please God, the basin were done, and Mr. Hancock come again and again with his rich orders. Mr. Lapham was angry. He could tell Johnny's time. If Mr. Lapham were angry, he could sell Johnny's time to Paul Revere. The four girls, still dressed in their pretty go-to-meeting frocks, watched him with fascinated, admiring eyes. Their mother sent them out of doors. Did the smoke from the furnace show from the wharf? From Fish Street? Did they hear any comments? Having found for himself the proper willow charcoal, Johnny went quickly ahead with his casting. He set his 2 wax models in wet sand. The furnace was piping hot. His hands were very sure. He was confident he could do the work, yet inside he was keyed up and jumpy. Mrs. Lapham fussed about him, and he ordered her to do simple things. Not the draft yet, Mrs. Lapham. Now get to work with the bellows. Once he even told her to look sharp, and she took it with a humble, "Yes, Johnny." "Now fetch me the crucible." He turned to Dove. "Which one does he want, boy?" "I'll get her down." Dove went to the shelves where the crucibles for melting silver were kept. Johnny did not see Dove standing on a stool, reaching far back and carefully taking out a cracked crucible. Dusty saw him and giggled. He knew the crack in it was so small it was hard even to see. It might stand the heat of the furnace, but the chances are that it would not. That was why Mr. Lapham had put it so far back. Both he and Dove thought it would just about serve Johnny Tremain right. After the insufferable way he had been bossing everybody, if the crucible gave way and the hot silver did spill all over the top of the furnace, it would certainly make Johnny look like a fool after all his fussing. Johnny took the cracked crucible in his trusting hands, put it in silver ingots, set it on top of the furnace. Scylla flew in. "Ma, there's a man looking at our chimney." "How's he dressed?" "Seafaring man." No seafaring man ever objected to little Sabbath breaking, but mind if you see any deacons or constables. The work went on. Izana sat with the cat in her lap. He called to Mrs. Lapham to look sharp and put the old silver turnip watch where he could see it. The silver must be run at a certain speed and be allowed to cool for just so long. Mrs. Latham was so slavishly eager to help him, he almost felt fond of her. He did not notice Dusty and Dove snickering in the corner. Some of the beeswax he had used for his models had been left too near the furnace. It had melted and run over onto the floor. Johnny had been taught to clean up as he went along, but today he was in too much of a hurry to bother. "Johnny," cried Mrs. Latham, "isn't it time to pour? Look, the silver is melting and begun to wink." It was true. He moved forward delicately, his right hand outstretched. The crucible began to settle. Collapse. The silver was running over the top of the furnace like spilled milk. Johnny jumped toward it, his right hand still outstretched, and something happened. He never knew exactly what. His feet went out from under him, and his hand came down on top of the furnace. The burn was so terrible he at first felt no pain, but stood stupidly looking at his hand. For 1 second before the metal cooled, the inside of his right hand, from his wrist to his fingertip, was covered with solid silver. He looked at the back of his hand. It was as always. Then he smelled burned flesh. The room blackened and tipped around him. He heard a roaring in his ears. When he came to, he was stretched out upon the floor. Dorcas was trying to pour brandy down his throat. Mrs. Latham had plunged the burned hand into a pan full of flour and was yelling at Madge to hurry with her bread poultice. He saw Scylla's face. It was literally green. "Ma," she said, licking her white lips, "shall I run for Dr. Warren?" "No, no. Oh, wait, I've got to think. I don't want any of them doctors to know we was breaking Sabbath day, and we don't need no doctor just for a burn. Scylla, you run down to the wharf and you fetch old midwife Gran Hopper. These old women know better than any doctor how to cure things like this. Johnny, how do you feel?" "All right." "Hurt yet?" "Not yet." He knew it would later. Johnny lay in the birth and death room. This was hardly more than a closet with a tiny window off the kitchen, used for storage except in times of sickness. His hand had been done up in a linseed poultice. The smell of the linseed was stifling, and now on the second day the pain had really begun. His arm throbbed to the shoulder. Gran Hopper was in the kitchen talking to Mrs. Latham. "Mind you keep that poultice wet. Just leave it wrapped up and wet it now and then with lime water. There's more luck than anything else in things like this. If it don't come along good, I'll make a charm." Not many years before, Gran Hopper would have been hanged for a witch. She had the traditional vulnerable years, the toothless cackle, the mustache. Nor was she above resorting to charms. But she had had vast experience. No doctor in Boston knew more than she about midwifery and children's diseases. So far she had done as well as any of them, except for one thing. The hand had been allowed to draw together, to turn in on itself. It was less painful than if it had been held out. By the 4th day, ulceration had set in. This was considered nature's way of healing an injury. Gran Hopper gave him laudanum and more laudanum. There followed drowsy days and nights that ran together, a ceaseless roaring in his ears. There was nothing left of him but the pain and the drug. The fever abated, and with it the doses of the drug. Johnny had not once looked at his hands since he had stood before the furnace and seen it lined with silver. Gran Hopper said on the next day she would unwrap it and see, as she cheerfully put it, what was left. Thus far the pain and the drug and the fever had dulled his mind. He had not thought about the future, for of what use to anyone was a cripple-handed silversmith. But that night Gran Hopper's words haunted him. Next day she would see what was left. He was utterly unprepared for the sight of his hand when finally it was unwrapped and lay in the midwife's aproned lap. Mrs. Latham, Madge, Dorcas, all had crowded into the little birth and death room. Scylla and his Anna were in the kitchen, too frightened to go near him. "My," said Madge, "isn't that funny looking?" "The top part, Johnny, looks all right, although a little narrow, but Johnny, your thumb and palm have grown together." This was true. He bent and twisted his fingers. He could not get the thumb to meet the forefinger. Such a hand was completely useless, and for the first time he faced the fact that his hand was crippled. Now what will Johnny Tremain do? Can't be a silversmith if you can't use your hands. And he was only apprenticed to Mr. Latham to be a silversmith. Now he's got to find out what he can do with the rest of his life.